everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the webinar, Strategies to Combat Ransomware in Healthcare, AD Security and Recovery. Couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted to make sure everyone has an optimal listening experience. We do encourage you to ask questions. So depending on how you join today, either in the browser or through the app, you'll see a question or chat section in your meeting dashboard. Feel free to drop your questions there. We'll do our best to answer them. If we run short on time today, we will reach out to you individually and follow up and answer your question. This session will also be recorded and we'll email you a link in a couple days. At the end of the presentation, we will be sharing our contact information. So if you have any additional questions and/or are watching this on demand, you can reach out that way. Chaosoft is a software vendor focused on securing and managing Active Directory. Today, our featured speaker is Craig Birch. Craig brings over 24 years of hands-on experience in Active Directory architecture, operations, and security. This spans Active Directory, AD migrations, identity management, Entra ID, and Microsoft 365 technologies with a strong emphasis on securing these environments. Thank you, Craig, for joining us. Let's dive into some strategies to combat ransomware in the healthcare industry.
Thanks, Damon. But before we get started, I want you to think of a family member. Now imagine that family member was unable to receive healthcare service because that organization suffered a ransomware attack. That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We'll cover why healthcare, we'll discuss some ransomware trends, and then you'll learn some steps we can take to prevent, detect, and recover from ransomware. So why healthcare? There's three key areas that we're going to focus on: target-rich environment, easy target, and downtime. Let's first look at target-rich environment. Healthcare has PII and HIPAA data, including Social Security. This information goes for a much higher value on the dark web than traditional data like our credit card data. As well as if we look at easy target, attackers look at healthcare as an easy target because they lack funding compared to larger organizations. They may also have resource constraints, whether that be people or funding, as we discussed. And then lastly, skills gap, meaning there's no dedicated IT security team, a sysadmin wearing multiple hats with not a focus on Active Directory security, as well as from a downtime perspective, if a healthcare organization is down, it has a greater impact because of patient safety. That means they're going to be more likely to pay the ransomware. Now we understand healthcare. Now let's take a deeper dive at why Active Directory. Well, first of all, Active Directory is ubiquitous. 95% of all organizations use AD. It's also the favorite place for attackers. So most widely used directory service for authentication and authorization. It's a 24-year-old technology that wasn't built for today's security challenges. What do I mean by that? Remote workforce, cloud. It's also overlooked, forgotten technology. As well as once an attacker's in, it provides the attacker an easy way to map your Windows ecosystem. And it holds the keys to everything: users, credentials, applications, access. And attackers have common tools that they can use to go after this valuable resource, which include things like Mimikatz, AD Explorer, PowerShell, O365, Creeper, Rubius, just to name a few. And again, these are easily downloadable from GitHub or any other services out there. They also know that a disruption of the service has critical impacts. It actually brings the business to a stop. So again, it's widely used. It's a 24-year-old technology. It's often overlooked by organizations, but not by the attackers. So now that we understand Active Directory, let's understand how Active Directory plays a role in healthcare. First, we'll look at central authentication. So what do I mean by this? Well, Active Directory is often used as the identity repository for single sign-on. So How do we log into our systems? It also plays a key role in authorization. Things like access to applications and resources. It's heavily integrated within the critical healthcare applications, electronic health records, our clinical systems. Additionally, Active Directory plays a key role in the security and compliance, whether that be access control or helping the healthcare organization maintain auditing and logging requirements in an organization. So now let's look at some current ransomware trends. The first one we're going to look at is frequency and sophistication. I'm not going to focus specifically on the rise in attacks. What I want to focus here on are the advanced techniques that we're seeing. Things like ransomware as a service, malware as a service, and info stealers. And they're no longer just focusing on traditional ransomware where they get an organization to go in and encrypt the data or the systems, but they're also moving on to more advanced extortion techniques, double extortion techniques, where they perform the normal ransomware activities, but now they're actually taking the data, uploading it to the dark web, and basically threatening organizations that they will leak this data and causing the organization to react and respond and pay the ransomware. If that doesn't work, they move on to what we call triple, where it's either a denial of service against their applications or even going after their customers or the people that were impacted in the ransomware. We will see that the ransomware actors will actually use that data to then to go after the individuals themselves. A more recent trend we're seeing is these ransomware are no longer just focusing on just normal healthcare organizations. They're actually going after and attacking our supply chain, our partners and our payer networks. And also going after smaller healthcare organizations. Why? Because they're perceived vulnerable and they also have a higher impact due to the location. So if a ransomware threat actor can go in and take a rural healthcare offline, it has a much higher impact because maybe the next hospital's a lot further in distance. And that usually means that the healthcare organization is more likely to pay again. As healthcare advanced and was able to support remote work and telehealth, these are also ways that the ransomware actors are going after these virtual options as well, disrupting the telehealth and remote workforce. So let's look at some of the most active ransomware groups. I'm not going to hit on all of them, but the three that are highlighted here are unique. So all three of these highlighted have ransomware as a service. They actually developed their service using modern code that is cross-platform, efficient, and hard to detect by EDR and other solutions out there. As well as there's a new player on the market, Quillen, who is not on this list, but is involved in ransomware against healthcare. And we'll dig into some of those in this next slides. Now let's look at some ransomware attacks. But before we go into the specifics around the attacks, I want you to understand all of these ransomware attacks had a direct impact to patient healthcare. So now let's look at January 2024. Black Suit targeted an organization called Group Healthcare Cooperative out of South Central Wisconsin. This impact had over 533,000 patient records. As well as if we look at February of 2024, Change Healthcare was attacked by Black Cat, and this is probably the most notorious ransomware event when it comes to healthcare to date. The impact estimated 1 billion in revenue and millions of patient records stolen. If we move forward to May of 2024, where Black Basta targeted Ascension Healthcare Alliance, this ransomware event impacted 12 of their 19 states that they supported, as well as it took them 36 days to fully recover. And then if we look to June of 2024, where Quillen and Black Suit were involved, we'll first look at Synovus. The impact there interrupted pathology services and patient data was stolen. Special health resources impacted approximately 1,000 hospitals. So again, these ransomware attacks have a direct impact to patient healthcare, putting these patients at risk. Now, let's understand some common entry points for ransomware. The first one we've probably all heard of, phishing, email attack. If we're not familiar with it, it's really where an attacker spoofs an email, maybe from your HR system, that says, go enroll in your 2024 benefits. The individual clicks on that particular enrollment email, and then behind the scenes, there's some code launched. And that code may download some additional software to the machine or just go after and steal the credentials. So let's move to the next one, compromised credentials. This could come from password attacks. It could come from phishing, like we just previously discussed, as well as you can actually go out and buy credentials on the dark web from previously breached organizations. The next one is all about software vulnerabilities. These are typically associated with a software bug and requires patching. Things like Windows, Linux, VMware is a current target right now, as well as the last one, misconfiguration. So what is a misconfiguration? It's an incorrect setting that allows an attacker to gain access. It could be a firewall. It could be a piece of software. It could be your identity platforms themselves that are not properly configured. So now let's look a little bit deeper what happens once they're in the door. So post-entry tactics. The first thing that an attacker will do is try to move laterally. So what is lateral movement? It's really a technique used by attackers to move within the victim's network. Usually the initial entry could be, again, those software vulnerabilities or misconfigurations, or even that initial credential. Once they're in, they're moving laterally to move from machine to machine. They're trying to get local privileges. An attacker needs to gain local privileges on a device. Why? So they can install software, disable security tools like EDR, as well as gather initial cache credentials. Once they gather those initial cache credentials, they'll review them to see if any of those are high privileged. And if they're not, they'll then look for AD reconnaissance and move to privilege escalation. So now they either go after and attack these weaknesses within your identity platforms to get privilege escalation within your domain or network. Once they get those privileges, the next thing that they move forward to typically is extract and encrypt. They extract the data using a double extortion technique, upload it to the dark web, and then they go back in and encrypt all your data and your systems so that you cannot recover from this attack. They also will try to cover their tracks. They'll attempt to wipe and clear security and event logs to make it much harder to perform forensics analysis. Let's look at this a little bit deeper. So let's look at Black Hat ransomware attack chain. We'll go into the specifics here, but let's understand who they are first. They were responsible for Change Healthcare attack. They use Rust language, which is a modern language that makes them cross-platform capable, meaning they can attack Linux, they can attack Windows at the same time. They're more efficient. This code, because it's a modern code, is more efficient. They can launch multi-processes, and it's much harder to detect than traditional ransomware. They're actually known for double extortion, which we talked about earlier. In fact, instead of listing their information on a Tor site on the dark web, they were the first to ever host their own public leak site. And their initial access methods often involve a software vulnerability and a credential brief. So if we look at this particular example, it focuses on an exploited exchange server. They move on and perform those discovery techniques, moving laterally, getting credentials along the way, performing additional lateral movement and privilege escalation, moving to exfiltration, and then full-on ransomware. This is not the exact technique that was used within Change Healthcare that we know of, because that information has not been disclosed, but this is a common tactic with Black Hat ransomware attack chain. So what are some of the common attack vectors for Active Directory? The first thing we'll look at is password attacks. So what do we mean by password attacks? So this could be brute forcing. So I'm targeting an individual account, or I could be going with a password spray technique, which is more common, where I go low and slow in your environment, trying a bunch of different passwords across your user base, not tripping your account lockout policy and maybe even your logs. The next one we'll look at is Kerberos ticket attacks. So what is Kerberos? Kerberos is involved in the authentication of Active Directory. It involves where attackers can steal Kerberos tickets from compromised system, forge Kerberos tickets as well. And then let's look at some hybrid attacks. What do we mean by a hybrid attack? Attacking hybrid identity. It could be attacking the administrator, right? The AAD sync service account. So a hybrid attack could be coming from on-prem, or it could be coming from Entra ID, or both. Now let's look at AD delegations. I call this one shadow admins. This is a very hard area for organizations to get their hands on. What does this involve? Exploiting accounts, groups, and devices that have been granted elevated permissions to sensitive areas of Active Directory, but don't necessarily belong to what we call those privileged groups within an organization. So they're very difficult to find within an organization. Misconfigured attributes. Inside of Active Directory and Entra ID, there's all kinds of settings that make up the security. Some of these could be attributes on a particular object, a user account. These misconfigured attributes can allow an attacker to gain lateral movement and privilege escalation if not properly secured. So that's Active Directory. Now let's move on to what it looks like for Entra ID. So common attack vectors in Entra ID is a little bit different when it comes to some of these, but similar in nature. Security tokens. So what's that involve? Now I'm stealing refresh tokens and forging fake SAML tokens to get access through federation. Could involve dangerous API permissions. What are API permissions? They're the permissions within the Entra applications that allow me to get access to critical resources. In fact, this technique, along with one of the others I'll be discussing, was used recently in an attack called Midnight Blizzard that was performed against Microsoft themselves earlier in 2024. We'll get into that when we talk about the cross-tenant attacks, as well as illicit consent grant. So now, using a phishing technique, I send a fake grant or email that tricks either the admin and the user to basically consent grant to either application data or even the tenant itself, if it was an administrator. And then cross-tenant attacks. So what are cross-tenant attacks? Well, first we need to understand that cross-tenant access settings were used to manage B2B collaboration between different organizations. But if misconfigured, it can also allow an attacker to go from one tenant to another tenant. And that's exactly what occurred in the Microsoft Midnight Blizzard. They were able to first take advantage of the cross-tenant capability, but also take advantage of the dangerous API permissions. So what are some of the commonly attacked AD misconfigurations inside of these environments? Let's take a deeper look. Common AD misconfiguration attacks. The first one, password attacks, we'll do a deeper dive on. Then we'll look at permissions and delegations, and then we'll dive into Kerberos attacks. And then lastly, we'll close out with hybrid attacks when we're looking at these misconfigurations. So let's look at password attacks. So password attacks, there's a couple areas that I'm going to focus on. Now, these are not every area in regards to password attacks. There are many different types of attacks, and we will not be able to cover all those attacks in this webinar. But the first one we're going to talk about are weak password policies. This is the most commonly misconfigured area inside of these platforms. What do I mean by weak password policies? Well, let's look at it from just a user password policy that's applied through Active Directory at the domain level. Usually that involves a weak password policy where the character length is just too short or there's not enough complexity. Now let's look at another password policy that we should be deploying within our organization. It's called fine-grained password policy. What do you mean by fine-grained password policy? Fine-grained password policy is actually deployed against your privileged accounts and your service accounts, and it's targeted by a group. This allows me to have a separate password policy from my users that's much harder for my privilege and service accounts. So the next area that we're going to look at is multi-factor authentication not being enabled. You're probably thinking, all my privileged accounts have multi-factor authentication enabled. We're good. That's enough, right? It's not enough. When we look at multi-factor authentication, we need to extend that further beyond just privileged accounts. Every account that logs into our system should be MFA enabled. And then now let's talk about one of these hidden attributes inside of our Active Directory called password not required. This one's hard to detect in an organization if you're not aware of it, as well as if I have this attribute stamped on my account, then it makes my password policy, whether I'm using the default domain password policy or the fine-grained password policy on these accounts, mute. It's not applicable if this particular attribute is found on the account. So what am I talking about? So inside of Active Directory, there is basically an attribute on the user account control that can be set called password not required. So what's this mean? This allows someone that has the ability to reset the password of this account to actually set a blank password. I've found this many of times in organizations where password not required is set on a lot of accounts in that organization. Typically, it's involved in identity and access management system that provision these accounts, but it also can be used as an attack method for backdooring. So imagine that an attacker has elevated rights in an organization and they want to go in and create some additional backdoors. If an organization doesn't know about this attribute, I can go in and set the password not required attribute on a privileged account. Later, going in and then resetting that password, and away I go with elevated privileges in the organization. So again, not something that might be top of mind for a lot of organizations because they're like, hey, I have a password policy, I'm good, right? Not necessarily. We need to look at password not required to make sure that we are. Additionally, you should apply the MFA, and this can help with that. Now let's look at group 2, permissions and delegations. We talked a little bit about AD delegations and shadow admin. So what are those? Again, those are the elevated objects inside of our Active Directory that have permissions that look like admin permissions, but not necessarily in those built-in groups like your domain admins, your built-in administrator, etc. Dangerous API permissions. We'll do a little bit deeper dive on that, and then we'll do a deeper dive on one of the most critical objects in Active Directory called admin SD holder and the permissions behind that and how it's being used today. So let's look at dangerous API permissions. So what are dangerous API permissions? So dangerous API permissions are these API permissions that are set on Entra ID applications. These permissions are used to allow access to other resources within Entra ID, within certain M365 services. So what are we looking at? So what are some of the most commonly abused API permissions that we should be looking at? Well, first of all, you should focus on any third-party applications or internal applications that have write permissions. But there are ones that are even more dangerous. Things like directory read-write all, role management read-write directory, and application role assignment read-write. These all can lead to a total takeover of your Entra environment if not properly understood. So you really should lock these down to the applications that need it and then watch these applications very closely because, again, these can be used in an attack. So you want to make sure that someone can't add additional credentials outside of what they were intended to do. Now, let's talk about admin SD holder. Why am I going to talk about this object? It is the most critical object in Active Directory when it comes to securing administrative access. Admin SD holder is an object inside of Active Directory that is actually used as a permission rule template by a backend process called SD-prop. SD-prop runs every 60 minutes in an organization. And what I want you to understand is that once that runs, it looks to the admin SD holder. It focuses on the security ACLs from that object and then propagates it to where? Well, the security ACLs of the building administrators group, domain admins, etc. So this is important because attackers will leverage this as a persistence technique, and it's an immediate privilege escalation as well. So if admin SD holder is compromised, it can lead to a total domain takeover because now your entire administrative model is compromised as well. And again, because there's a process associated with them, even if you tried to remove, as an admin would go in and try to remove the permissions off the individual object itself, if they didn't understand how admin SD holder worked, that backend process would just put the permissions right back. So it's a great way for an attacker to establish persistence in an organization. Now let's look at some Kerberos attacks. The first one we'll talk about is unconstrained Kerberos delegation. So let's look at what that means. So unconstrained Kerberos delegation on a machine could allow an attacker to compromise or impersonate any credentials across all services in the domain that logged into that machine. The next one that we'll look at is golden ticket. So golden ticket is where is a special attack where I go after the KRBTGT account, which is associated with signing all Kerberos tickets, and I forge a fake ticket, which typically, if an organization doesn't reset the KRBTGT password on a regular basis, if I use a tool like Mimikatz, would be good for 10 years. And then if I have the KRBTGT password and I forge a golden ticket, I can impersonate any account in the organization. The last one we're going to go into is a little bit in more detail is Kerberosing. So let's look at Kerberosing and what that looks like. So Kerberosing involves privileged accounts with service principal names. So what is a service principal name? A service principal name is added to an object within the Active Directory, whether it's a user account, it could be a machine account as well, but particularly it's going to be on a user account or like a service account within the organization. And these pose a great risk because of this technique called Kerberosing. So Kerberosing is where we go out and target these accounts, then we can perform an offline brute force attack and use a tool like Hashcat or something like that to then breach the credentials. And because they carry high privileges, like maybe domain admins or even built-in administrator rights in the organization, it can be a big problem for organizations from a total domain compromise. In fact, this technique is not that hard to perform. It's very well written. I joke to my wife around this particular attack is I have a daughter who doesn't know anything about Kerberosing, but I could probably teach her how to Kerberos Active Directory in a matter of a few hours because it's widely available out there to download, and the technique is very common. And we find this in a lot of organizations. So now let's look at hybrid attacks. There's a couple different hybrid attacks that we're going to focus on. Abusing Entra ID Connect Sync. So what does that mean? So inside of a hybrid environment, we have this service account that is used to synchronize objects from our on-prem Active Directory to our Entra ID environment. It usually will start with MSOL_GUID if you're using Entra ID Connect Sync. It may look different if you're using an older version of AD Sync. This account can be attacked to gain access from on-prem as well as from Entra ID because they carry high privileges in both environments. The other one is an AD user in a privileged Entra role, which we'll go into a little bit deeper, and then also privileged AD user in an Entra ID. So let's understand what those last two mean. Let's take a deeper dive. If we look at AD user in a privileged Entra role, first of all, what does that mean? So now I have an account that started with them on-prem. We synchronize that account, so it's a hybrid account, and I now add it to a privileged Entra role. Well, why is this a problem? Well, now I can attack both Entra ID as well as on-prem Active Directory. So I have two, from a defense perspective, I have two control planes that I need to defend against. So what should you do in this case? Well, the first thing you need to do is create cloud-only accounts. Additionally, you must make those cloud-only accounts MFA enabled. You do not want hybrid accounts in privileged roles because it's hard to defend multiple attack planes, so you just increase your attack surface unnecessary. Let's look at the inverse of this. That would be a privileged AD user starting on-prem synced to Entra. So now I have an account inside of my Active Directory that is considered a privileged user, and they are synced to Entra ID. And now again, I have given the attacker two control planes that they can go after me, two attack control planes. So from a defense perspective, I have to then defend on-prem Active Directory and Entra ID. And if I'm able to compromise this, depending on what configurations are in there, it may lead to both a full domain takeover as well as a full tenant takeover. So these are things that we need to look for in our organization. So now we've talked about all these different areas. There must be some solutions out there that can help us. So let's take a look at that. So what are the traditional defense strategies? Well, the first thing we might try is defending the perimeter. So let's understand what I mean by perimeter. Well, that could be deploying next-gen firewalls. It could also be deploying host-based firewalls. The problem with this is we have remote workforce, we have cloud resources, so it's very hard to defend the perimeter. In fact, in a zero trust world, there's no such thing as a perimeter. And I would go as far as saying the new perimeter is no longer those firewalls. It is the identity itself. So now let's look at our next thing that we could try: vulnerability management, patching. So why is this not a good method? First of all, let me say this is all needed for a defense in-depth strategy, but singly these are not going to address the issue. So what's some of the challenges with vulnerability management? There's too many zero-day vulnerabilities for organizations to keep ahead of the threat actors, as well as threat actors are able to create proof of concept exploitation code at a much faster pace than what they were able to do previous years. So the next thing we try to focus on is, okay, we can't protect the perimeter. It's too hard to patch everything. Let's protect the endpoint. So what's the challenges with protecting the endpoint? Let's understand that a little bit different. Well, to protect the endpoint, you have to know 100% what your endpoints are. Most organizations struggle with even understanding what are their endpoints. That's the first problem. Once we understand the endpoints, now we need to make sure we need to get an agent to those endpoints. Another challenge, as well as newer techniques can trick endpoint detection to looking like normal activity, as well as even more sophisticated techniques know how to disable endpoint protection. So now we focus on multi-factor authentication. Again, multi-factor authentication works perfect, and it works good for human accounts in most cases. But there are areas in our environment that multi-factor authentication will not work. It could be our service accounts. It could be Entra ID applications. They do not require multi-factor authentication, but they can be used for authentication and authorization to such systems. So now we move on to a SIM. So system integrated event monitoring, right, or management. So what does that mean? So let's look at, we're going to go out and aggregate all these logs from multiple systems and then send it into a central location, whether that be a SOC or some other team. Well, there's a couple challenges with that as well. The first thing is, what if I'm sending all these events in from all these systems, what is real and what's not real? So there's what we call event log fatigue or system fatigue to our SOC team, as well as these are after the fact, right? So these events are after the event occurred, right? They're already in our door. The next problem is these attackers are smart. They know most environments deploy SIM technology because it's required, right? It's in a defense in depth strategy. So what do they do to get around these things? Well, they can look like normal activity, but more, they will move to changing your advanced audit policy so you're not getting all the signals that you need to send to the SIM, as well as clearing event logs. So now your SIM is rendered blind. You're flying blind if you're just relying strictly on SIM technology. Now let's look at pen testing and point-in-time AD assessments. So what is it? So I might hire a third party to come into my organization and perform a pen test. And this is great to get an initial assessment of how I am doing, from my environment. But if a pen tester finds what they're looking for, they might not go deep enough in the assessment. As well as both the pen test and a point-in-time AD assessment is exactly that. It's point in time. It's only as good as the time that I performed the test or gathered the information. The problem with that approach is, on its own, is these identity platforms, they're dynamic in nature. They're constantly being updated. So I may think I'm good until I find out that I'm not good. And usually when we find out we're not good, we're already dealing with either a ransomware or something that we have to report to our leaders. And then lastly, well, we'll just plan for standard backup and recovery. So let's understand what that means. Well, if we look at standard backup and recovery, the first thing you have to understand is, can you recover the system, right? Is the backup even good? That's the first challenge. Secondly, how do you know if you recover that you're going to recover to a pre-breach state? If I just recovered an environment and I put it to a breach state, I'm going to have to go through that recovery process again. And we've seen this with previous organization. There was an organization in the automobile industry where they stated that they suffered a ransomware attack 3 times in less than 6 months. It's not likely that they suffered a ransomware attack 3 times in 6 months, by the way, but it is likely that they did recover to a pre-breach state. So what can we do? Well, I'm going to talk about some things we can do from a prevention perspective, detection, as well as recovery. So let's first look at prevention. So as ransomware and cyber threats evolve, we too must shift how we traditionally try to prevent these attacks by adopting and enforcing more modern technologies and strategies. That's a mouthful. So let's really break this down. So what can we do? Well, we can move to implementing and adhering to zero trust principles. Let's understand a little bit about some of those principles. The first thing I want you to understand is, in a zero trust principle world, we have to assume breach. We have to assume the attacker is already on our network. So every authentication request, every access request could be malicious in nature. There's many other things around zero trust principles that we could dive into, but I want to talk about some of these other ones as well. Implement and enforce phishing resistant multi-factor authentications. So more biologics, right? Biometrics is what I meant to say there. Biometric techniques, as well as moving to just-in-time permissions for elevated accounts. So what do I mean? So grant permissions only when the access is required for the role, and for the duration that they need to perform the task. We need to focus on identity governance, including automation and provisioning, deprovisioning. But not only the accounts, we also need to focus on the access. We need to assess and identify misconfigurations, especially within our identity platforms or within our identities themselves, ones that an attacker could leverage for lateral movement and privilege escalation. We know that patching in traditional vulnerability is not enough, so we need to adopt a continuous exposure management solutions. So now we talked about prevention. Now let's talk about what we can do around detection. Again, ransomware and cyber extortion requires a mind shift to what and how we monitor for these types of attacks. Well, if we're going to be able to detect attacks in our environment, we have to have complete visibility of the entire ecosystem. We need to know our endpoints. We need to know our identity platforms. We need to know where those permissions exist. We also have to introduce continuous threat detection. We need to be able to detect new misconfigurations. We need to alert about real-time attacks and respond to real-time attacks. Real-time change monitoring, right? Who, what, where, and when did they attack? Or what was changed? The ability to even roll back those changes if they're malicious in nature. We need solutions that are purpose-based monitoring for identity and identity platforms because of the unique challenges that we talked about. User environment behavior analysis. So if an account that has never created accounts is now creating accounts, that's suspicious activity. We need to be able to detect those types of activities and alert our team so that they can quickly get in front of this before it turns into something much worse. As well as we need to focus on technologies that do not rely solely on event logs for alerting. We talked about there's a need for event logs, but we know that this is a common technique for attackers to evade event logs and even clear. So we cannot rely strictly on event log alerting. We need solutions that go outside of that. So now we talked about detection strategies. Now I want to focus on recovery strategies. Let's understand this. The key to recovering from a ransomware attack starts with a well-tested recovery plan. I'm going to say that one more time, just because it's that important. The key to recovering from a ransomware attack starts with a well-tested recovery plan. So what does it require to develop a recovery plan? Well, we first need to identify our mission-critical applications and the supporting infrastructure. And it's not enough just to focus on the applications and the infrastructure. We also need to understand the teams required for recovery of these systems and train them. We then have to back up all these identified systems. Frequently test these recoveries of these environments. The next step to recovering post-ransomware is containment and assessment. What do we mean by this? We need to isolate the infected systems. How do we do this? We could disconnect any impacted systems from the network. That's the first step you should do. Then you're going to move on to identify and stop the source. Sounds easy. It might be very hard to identify the ransomware variant itself, but we can stop and prevent further encryption by blocking the communication channels. Then we have to focus on backup validation and restoration. So again, we need to go in and rebuild these systems. So rebuild any systems that you can't recover from backup. Once we rebuild these systems, we need to make sure they're patched and up to date. And we have new backups of these systems before we introduce them back on the network. We need to monitor and test. Monitor for resurgence. Test any restored systems and the backups before they're connected to the network. We need to have a detailed communication plan, a communication plan that includes stakeholders, our partners, our third-party teams, as well as our end users. Once we have that defined communication plan, once we're done with the incident, we need to have some incident documentation. What do I mean by this? There's some key things you need to focus on. Timeline. So when did it occur? Impact. What was the impact to our environment? What were the recovery steps? And most importantly, any lessons learned from that event so that we can move to the next step, enhance and secure our environment. So implement maybe some new security best practices. If you're not using MFA, implement MFA. If we're not following least privilege model, implement least privilege. Zero trust. Again, and then lastly, we need to run through, update, and retest that plan. So again, one more time, the key to recovering from a ransomware attack starts with a well-tested recovery plan. So now I'm going to turn it over to Damon, and he's going to close out this presentation.
Thanks, Craig. Appreciate great content. Wonderful, I think, for this audience. Only a couple more slides to get through, but I'm going to try and tie KOSoft to some of the things that Craig talked about. So KOSoft offers a complete kind of solution suite for managing and securing, whether it's Active Directory, Entra ID, Teams, Intune, Microsoft 365. We describe it as manage, monitor, recover, and it falls in line with how Craig has kind of discussed these ransomware strategies. So Craig, if you could click, where kind of prevention, just go back real quick. Prevention equals manage, detection equals monitor, and recovery equals recover. So that's where I'm trying to tie the ransomware strategies to kind of how we talk about ourselves. So if you can advance the slide, please. There we go. So if we talk about manage, we bring the ability to apply granular roles and policies to ensure least privilege and user governance. We can automate tasks that both have an administrative and a security benefit. Think automated provisioning and deprovisioning of user access. KOSoft uses a combination of roles and rules and automation to prevent mistakes and changes that can spell disaster for your organization. So with monitor, we continually look for unwanted changes. They could be misconfigurations, they could be security risks, they could be internal, external threats. Any unwanted change can be instantly reversed, ensuring safety and consistency. And then with recover, we make it instant, whether it's an object, attribute, all the way up to multi-forest. We deliver a patent pending modern approach to forest recovery that works literally in seconds and automatically backs up, deploys to a standby environment, and tests that it works. And we do this every single day. We do it every day, so you know if a disaster strikes at any time, you can recover with the push of a button. Next slide, please. So I want to thank you for spending time with us today. If you're interested in a demo, a quote, a trial, or a question, we have some of these easy URLs to remember. If you prefer following us on social, you can check us out on LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, Facebook. YouTube's always an option too. You can search for KOSoft. Unfortunately, we've kind of run out of time for questions. I still encourage you to still submit that question, and we will respond to you individually. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.